Ladies and gentlemen, today's special edition of Polish Kalejdoskop in English is fully dedicated to the story of Poland's capital, Warsaw. We would like to bring Poland, her cities and countryside, her tradition and culture, as well as her great personalities, closer to our Canadian friends. This program, therefore, is the first of the series of programs about Poland. I hope you will enjoy this program.
Śnieżne zamiecie, zielony maj. Pokażcie mi piękniejszy kraj na świecie, niż mi mój kraj, niż mój rodzinny kraj. La 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 la.
The city of Warsaw, the Polish say Warszawa, stands on both banks of the Vistula River, in the center of the Mazovia district. It is the capital of Poland, a big modern city with more than 1.5 million inhabitants, most of them people of repressible zest and imagination. It is Poland's heart and at the same time her face. Although contemporary and modern, it also retains the unique character of an ancient city. The most famous historical site, Warsaw's Old Town, with its market square, affectionately dubbed Starówka, has since the last war been faithfully reconstructed and miraculously restored. It is yet another document of astonishing changes that have taken place in the nation's tradition and culture. A number of factors determined by the historical processes over the 7 centuries of Warsaw's existence had the impact on the city development, with all the possible effort involved in restoration. Preserved are churches and monuments, historic palaces, delightful boulevards and gardens within the old spatial arrangements of the city. Parks like Wilanów and Łazienki are on the top of an international list of the most beautiful architectural jewels. Many historic buildings attest to Warsaw's long period of development and to its role as the capital of Poland. Contemporary Warsaw is also the city of broad thoroughfares, skyscrapers, new districts of modern apartment houses, hotels, shopping centers, and other modern buildings characteristic for a leading industrial, administrative, scientific, and cultural center. It is hard to believe that this metropolitan city was rebuilt and reconstructed in the 30 years after the Second World War. The history of the years which have elapsed since the day of liberation from Nazi occupation is made up of the enormous effort of the Warsavians. The rebuilding of their capital and the reconstructing of its past became one of the top priority tasks. Historical sites are now only a minor fragment of present-day Warsaw, but they blend into the modern urban center, They are living proof that the armor of contemporary changes have not been able to conquer the voices of the past.
So, to preserve a relationship with the smoothest possible transition from the old to the new, you must maintain a continuity in the construction. The new city must respect the old city so that all the districts blend into one urban whole. That's the order of the day. In all the cities, as here in Warsaw, they're trying to provide and preserve the transitions between eras, styles, and heights with gradual, not traumatic changes. So the eras, the styles, the grandeur, enrich instead of diminish a continuity, which is the basis of urban balance.
Let's come back to the beginnings of the city 700 years ago. Warsaw's old town, the Polish Forum Romanum, is the oldest part of the city, born at the close of the 13th century when the castle was moved from Jazdów to the village Warszawa. In the 14th century, after the Dukes of Mazovia had transferred their capital here, brick houses built in the Gothic style replaced the old wooden ones. St. John's Cathedral is an abundant chronicle of events and an important historical monument of the city since the early 15th century. In a Renaissance tombstone here are buried the last Dukes of Mazovia and many famous Polish patriots. It was also the site of coronation of 2 Polish kings. The political and economic importance of Warsaw grew quickly in the 16th century, Poland's golden age. From the end of the 16th century, the Sejm, the Polish parliament, convened in Warsaw, and the elections of all the kings took place on the outskirts of the city. Finally, at the close of the 16th century, King Zygmunt III of the Wasa dynasty remodeled the castle and moved the capital of Poland from Kraków to Warsaw.
He was welcomed to the city in person and several years later immortalized in one of the earliest secular monuments in Europe, as his statue was installed on a lofty column. Ever since that moment, King Zygmunt's monument shares its symbolic role for Warsaw with the city crest, the mermaid with a sword. From his column, the king could admire the flourishing, beautiful city, modernized in the early Baroque style, adding a new look to the existing Gothic architecture. He loved to watch the stream of people on Castle Square and in adjoining streets. But from his vantage point, he would also witness Warsaw's battle-scarred history, its struggle to survive, an effort to rebuild, justifying its motto, defies the storms, as at least several attempts would be made to destroy it utterly. The first encounter of the stony Zygmunt with his favorite city's tragedy came just a few years after he was comfortably installed on his post. The first Swedish invasion, called the Deluge, devastated the city. The great Polish novelist Henryk Sienkiewicz describes the horror of these days.
The armies of the kingdom under the hetmans, Czarniecki's men, the regiments of the king, the infantry regiments of Zamoyski, the Lithuanians of Sapieha, and the legions of the general militia rushed towards the walls like a swollen river. But from behind the walls bloomed out against them rolls of white smoke and darts of flame. Heavy cannon, arquebuses, double-barreled guns, muskets thundered simultaneously. The earth was shaken in its foundations. Each attacked furiously what was nearest him. The hetmans, the gates of the new city. Czarniecki, Danzig House. Sapieha with the Lithuanians, the Church of the Holy Ghost. The Mazovians and men of Great Poland, the Kraków suburbs. The heaviest work fell to the last-mentioned men, for the palaces and houses along the Kraków suburbs were turned into fortresses. But that day, such fury of battle had seized the Mazovians that nothing could stand before their onset. They took by storm house after house, palace after palace. They fought in windows, in doors, in passages. After the capture of one house, before the blood was dry on their hands and faces, they rushed to another. Again, a hand-to-hand battle, and again they rushed farther. In the midst of a bloody struggle, the chapel of the Tsar Swiski and the lordly palace of the Kalejdoskop Polskis was captured. The Swedes were destroyed to the last man in the smaller buildings, in the stables of the magnates, in the gardens descending to the Vistula. Near the Kazanovsky Palace, the Swedish infantry tried to make a stand in the street, and reinforced from the walls of the palace, from the church and the bell tower of the Bernardines, which was turned into a strong fortress, they received the attack with cutting fire. Swedes and Poles were so mingled together that they formed one gigantic mass, which squirmed, twisted, and rolled in its own blood between the Kazanovsky Palace, the house of Radziejowski, and the Krakow Gate. But new legions of warriors, breathing blood, came on continually, like a foaming river from the direction of the Krakow Gate. The Swedish infantry was cut to pieces at last, and began that famous storm of the Kazanovsky Palace and the Bernardines Church, which in great part decided the fate of the day.
The period of relative peace in Warsaw, following the Second Swedish invasion, pleased King Zygmunt, as his subsequent successors put a lot of effort into making Warsaw more beautiful, more important, and more interesting. The city grew and expanded outside its old city limits. At the end of the 17th century, Wilanów was built by King Jan Sobieski, famous for the defeat of the Turks at Vienna. This summer residence just outside of Warsaw was designed by the royal architect Augustin Loczi and belonged to King Jan and his beloved wife Marysieńka. It is one of the most superb Baroque country seats in Central Europe, often compared to Versailles Palace in Paris. It is called the Little Versailles due to its smaller size, its interior decorations as the most beautiful in the Polish palaces. King Jan gave Warsaw not only the beautiful palace, but also coffee, which had not been known earlier in Poland. His hussars brought this delicacy from Kara Mustafa's camps after their Viennese victory, and therefore the first coffee houses, kawiarnie, were founded in Warsaw at the beginning of the 18th century. These places where young people could meet to exchange their progressive, reformatory, and later revolutionary ideas proved to play a very important role in the history of Warsaw. This period, the second half of the 17th century, was also very important in the architectural development of the city. The palaces of famous Polish magnates and noble families were built or remodeled according to the modern Baroque style. New churches and monasteries were erected, and King Zygmunt noticed with pleasure that the character of the city changed. It became more monumental and also more important on the European scene.
The Saxon period at the beginning of the 18th century followed. Together with the unfortunate decline of the Polish Commonwealth as a state, the forces of political change were gradually emerging. King Zygmunt's city was again in the center of these changes, making important progress in its development. Publicists put forward projects of political reform. The educational system was modernized by founding the Collegium Nobilium in Warsaw in 1740 by Stanisław Konarski. The brothers Zaluski organized in 1747 the first public library, one of the earliest and largest libraries in the world. Simultaneously, the Polish theater started to play a truly important role. Intellectual change was encouraged by the ideas of the Enlightenment, and the heart of change was beating in Warsaw. In architecture, the late Baroque was gradually replaced by the new Rococo style, as visible in the Wyzyczyn Church.
The reign of King Stanisław August Poniatowski, the last successor of King Zygmunt, was a period of tragic struggle for the rebirth and preservation of independence in Poland. A period of great achievements in the life of the nation, which nevertheless ended with the collapse of the state. In Warsaw, the center of the cultural movement, the Committee of National Education, in effect the first European Ministry of Education, began its activity in the city at the end of the 18th century. The most significant event of that period, however, was the proclamation of the parliamentary constitution in the city on May the 3rd, 1791. It was recognized as the first in Europe and the equal of what had recently been promulgated in America. A leading role in economic and cultural life was played by intelligentsia. The patronage of magnates and also the king decisively influenced the kind of art and architecture which at that time was the mixture of Italian Baroque and French classicism. It was the last Polish king who remodeled the interior of King Zygmunt's castle, so carefully prepared 200 years earlier to house the 8 subsequent Polish kings. Stanisław August presented Warsaw with a very special gift, the Łazienki Park, with its palace on the island and amphitheater, designed by the famous Italian architect Dominique Merlini. King Zygmunt received this gift from his last successor to add to the beauty of several palaces remodeled according to French classicism. The new summer residences on the banks of the Vistula River were also built. At the same time, the Commonwealth was on the verge of collapse. After a second partition of Poland, during Kościuszko's insurrection, heavy fighting broke out in Warsaw. As James Michener says in his novel Poland,
the end of Kościuszko's insurrection came with a force so terrible that all Europe shuddered. It was never known for sure who gave the order for the pacification of Praga. But some believed that Theodore Kuprin wrote it out as part of his grand design for the final partition. You must teach these Polish pigs a lesson. No better agent for such a lesson than Suvorov could have been found, for on the 1st of November 1794, he threw his massive Russian army around the suburb of Praga on the right bank of the Vistula opposite Warsaw, where a last remnant of some 14,000 Polish patriots had assembled to try to protect the capital. Praga also contained about 10,000 civilians who were doing what they could do to support the defenders of their little settlement. Against these Poles, Suvorov had brought up an army of nearly 40,000 professionals, and when the battle for Praga started, he told them, no mercy, no prisoners. We must teach these pigs a lesson. The siege lasted only 3 days, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of November, for on the 4th, the Russians broke through, and then the terrible slaughter began. Of the 14,000 Polish troops, only 4,000 escaped to cross the Vistula. The rest were gunned down mercilessly. Those who tried to surrender were shot as they raised their hands in the air. Thousands more were bayoneted when they sought to submit. Those who tried to resist were clubbed to death with rifle butts. Groups of 20 and 30 Russians would chase down an alley after one Polish soldier and stomp him to death when they caught him. And the only ones who survived were within the city were those few who hid themselves in the cellars until the fury passed.
the uprising was crushed, and the ensuing partition of Poland among Russia, Prussia, and Austria left Warsaw a provincial town under Prussian occupation. The city population declined from over 100,000 to only 60,000 in less than 10 years. This also led to a very stagnant period in Warsaw's urban development. Magnates and nobility, without the magnetic power of the royal court, abandoned any plans to remodel their residences. Warsaw was reinstated by Napoleon as the capital of the Duchy of Warsaw, but the emperor's downfall within the next few years led to the occupation of Warsaw by Russians. King Zygmunt would not see an independent Poland for over 100 years to come. The establishment of the Congress Kingdom during Russian occupation did not give autonomy to the country, but nevertheless it marked a very important date in the life and growth of Warsaw. The urban economy continued to expand. Some neoclassical buildings were erected, and monumental sculptures were the new element of the streets of Warsaw. National independence remained the exclusive goal of Warsaw, and Warsaw figured prominently with its young intelligentsia and officers preparing secretly for a national uprising. The capture of the arsenal, with the support of the Warsaw populace on the night of the 29th of November 1830, marked the beginning of the rebellion. The rebel armies were able to delay the Russian offensive at the approaches to Warsaw in the Battle of Grochów in 1831. But finally, Warsaw capitulated to overwhelming Russian armies, again with massive destruction.
In rebuilt Warsaw, however, the spirit returned. Economic growth continued, and by the mid-19th century, the city became the center of industry. The defeat by the Russians of the Warsaw-based January uprising of 1863 did not prevent further expansion of the city. After Poland gained her independence in November 1918, Warsaw regained its status as the national capital. Despite political instability and inflation, the period between world wars was marked by further social and cultural advances. Its emergence as a European cultural center was symbolized by the International Chopin Competition for pianists and the Wieniawski International Violin Competition. Unfortunately, King Zygmunt had to witness more horrible battles and devastating destruction of his beloved city from his lofty column. After Swedish invasions, clashes with Russian and Prussian troops during the Kosciuszko insurrection, the November uprising in 1830 and the January uprising in 1863 came the most vicious calamity of all, the Second World War. During the German occupation, the systematic and methodical destruction of the Polish capital occurred, ending in its final demolition during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. After cruelly crushing the resistance in the Wola district, the Nazis launched a violent attack on the old city. The first battle line ran through the cathedral. Tanks thundered and rolled through its interior. Barricades were put in its aisles. The ruins of blazing houses in Warsaw became graves of combatants and civilians who fought for their city with unparalleled heroism. Nearly 1 million people perished. West of the river, where the bulk of the city is located, there were virtually no survivors, something without precedent in world history. East of the river, only 150,000 people survived. Yet 3 months later, the population of Warsaw had rebounded to 500,000. Over 90% of Warsaw, including the old town and the royal castle, was reduced to rubble. Czesław Miłosz, the recent Nobel Prize winner for literature, describes those first days of freedom in his novel, The Captive Mind.
In April of 1945, after the Germans had been expelled by the Red Army, the battles were then raging at the gates of Berlin, Alpha and I returned to Warsaw and wandered together over the mounds of rubble that had once been streets. We spent several hours in a once familiar part of the city. Now we could not recognize it. We scaled the slope of red bricks and entered upon a fantastic moon world. There was total silence. As we worked our way downward, balancing to keep from falling, ever new scenes of waste and destruction loomed before us. In one of the gorges, we stumbled upon a little plank fastened to the metal bar. The inscription, written in a red paint or in blood, read, "Lieutenant Zbyszek's Roads of Suffering." I know what Alpha's thoughts were at that time, and they were mine. We were thinking of what traces remain after the life of a man. These words rang like a cry to heaven from a shattered earth. It was a cry for justice. Who was Lieutenant Zbyszek? Who among the living would ever know what he had suffered? We imagined him crawling along this trail, which some comrade, probably long since killed, had marked with this inscription. We saw him as, with an effort of his will, he mastered his fleeting strength and, aware of being mortally wounded, thought only of carrying out his duty. Why? Who measured his wisdom or his madness? Was this a monad of Leibniz fulfilling its destiny in the universe, or only the son of the postman, obeying a futile maxim of honor installed in him by his father, who himself was living up to the virtues of a courtly tradition?
Warsawians started to rebuild their city, and Warsaw failed to die as had been hoped by its oppressors. In the years 1949 to 1963, the program of reconstruction worked miracles, and new walls for a new life grew up on the ruins. A considerable number of buildings were reconstructed. Fragments of historic architecture and interior decoration were conscientiously restored and conserved. There was only one major object missing from Warsaw's landscape: the royal castle.
Warsaw is the heart of Poland. The heart of Warsaw for 700 years was the royal castle which towers over the Vistula. It's in this castle that the kings of Poland first translated the traditions and art of Poland into stone, brick, wood, and paintings. It was also here for 700 years that were signed, announced, or broken the treaties and the hopes of Poland, which was continually invaded, continually conquered, and rebuilt. The bombing of the royal castle started in September of 1939 and stopped only in 1944, leaving but one stone door standing. Orders had been given to destroy it completely, not to leave any trace of it, so that it would mark the end of the Polish state. It was only after having completely reconstructed the Polish capital that the Polish people decided on the 20th of January 1971 to reconstruct the entire royal castle.
Thanks to voluntary donations by thousands of Warsavians, the entire Polish nation, as well as those Poles residing abroad, the reconstruction of the royal palace was finished in the late 70s, and its interiors were decorated. Modernization of the castle square followed. The subsequent works and geological excavations revealed the remains of old architecture, some objects not mentioned in any historical records. The spirit of royal power, dominating in Warsaw ever since King Zygmunt nominated the city for its capital role, is now reincarnated. So the royal castle stands again in its present magnificent state as a proof of the heroism and the rebirth of the city of Warsaw. It was once believed that every Pole is born with a sword in his right hand to fight for the land he loves, and a brick in his left hand to rebuild every trace of damage, material and spiritual. The history of Warsaw makes this belief very real. Today, King Zygmunt looks again proudly at his beautiful city and his courageous people waving solidarity banners. They would prefer to die than to sacrifice their freedom. And, as the words of the song say, they never stop fighting for their city and their country.
Mi zostało tęsknić dziś, tulać się wiatrem porwany liść i słuchać szumu biblijnych rzek, a we śnie widzieć wiślany brzeg. I walczyć, walczyć, ale nie we śnie, o ziemię, którą stracił we wrześniu. O dom scalony, o zwykłe życie, o grób mej matki, do śmierci bić się. I serce włożyć, kochane ręce,